Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the National Sea Grant Law Center and Ohio Sea Grant's webinar on plastic legislation in the Great Lakes. We are pleased to partner with Ohio Sea Grant to share some of the research we've been doing on plastic legislation in the Great Lakes. So today I'm joined by Sarah Lowe, Great Lakes Regional Coordinator for the NOAA Marine Debris Program, Jill Bartolotta, Extension Educator with Ohio Sea Grant, and Tara Bowling, Senior Staff Attorney here at the National Sea Grant Law Center. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar and we will make it available for public viewing after the event. So we'll be sending an email with more details about how to access the recording. And we have everyone's microphones muted to reduce background noise, but please use the chat box at any time if you have questions for the speakers. They may not see them during their presentations, but we will have time after each presenter to go through any questions that you have, and there may be time at the end for questions as well. So while the main focus of today's webinar is plastic pollution in the Great Lakes, we wanted to take just a few minutes to set the stage a bit from the global context. And I want to take a moment to thank Jenna Santacroce, junior public policy major here at the University of Mississippi, who just started working for the National Sea Grant Law Center as a student intern, and for her help in putting together these slides. So the scale of plastic pollution is quite overwhelming, and the numbers can be a bit mind-boggling. By 2050, scientists estimate that there will be about 11 billion tons, a billion metric tons worth of plastic in our landfills, which would equal the weight of 35,000 Empire State Buildings, which is just crazy. But more important for our presentation, about 91% of disposed plastics are not recycled, even including those that are sent to recycling facilities, either because they're contaminated or there's no market for them. Approximately 8 million metric tons of plastics enter the oceans every year, and 22 million pounds of plastic is estimated to enter the Great Lakes each year. So there's just a lot of plastic out there entering both our freshwater and marine environments. China is the world's leading contributor to mismanaged plastic waste at about 28%, followed by Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. As you can imagine, many of those countries have rapidly developing economies, increasing consumption because as their living conditions improve, increased waste, but they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to handle that waste. But that doesn't mean that those of us here in the United States are, off the hook. We actually generate more plastic waste per person per day than any other nation. And we are often sending our plastic waste to these developing countries, to recycle or use in other ways. And so we're all connected and contributing to the problem. So the most immediate and visual impact of plastic pollution is the unsightliness. Images like these have been the focus of social media and awareness campaigns for years. The most polluted beach in the world is apparently off the coast of Hawaii. That's the top left photo, where 90% of the garbage found on the beach is plastic. But we all know that aquatic species often become entangled and suffocated by large plastics or die of starvation if they are mistaking plastics for food. And as awful as these images are, though, the greater environmental concern is the impacts that we can't see, right? That plastics may be entering the human and animal food chains through consumption or absorption of microplastics and the chemicals that are found in those microplastics. and that the small aquatic organisms obviously ingest those toxins or those microplastics, and then the larger fish and animals, you know, consume those all the way up to us. And so there are a variety of concerns about the scale of this problem. So although there isn't a binding international treaty that addresses plastic pollution, there have been efforts to engage the international community around the problem. In 2011, the United Nations Environment Assembly of the UNEP and NOAA developed the Honolulu Strategy to promote intergovernmental action. The Honolulu Strategy is a framework document. It's non-binding, but it provides a focal point for improved collaboration and coordination among stakeholders in the development of marine debris programs. And the author stressed that implementation of sustainable, strategic, coordinated, and comprehensive initiatives, as like those outlined in the strategy, will require support from all levels of government. So global, regional, national, and local levels. And throughout the rest of the webinar, we'll kind of be looking at the different levels in the Great Lakes. In 2018, 5 of the G7 nations agreed to an oceans plastics charter. That's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. The United States and Japan were the only 2 countries to not sign on. But this charter sets some very lofty goals, including making all plastics recyclable by 2030, and reducing single-use plastics and promoting the use of recycled plastics. So whether or not that can be achieved remains to be seen, but individual countries are also taking action related to single-use plastics, which will be the focus of the remaining presentations. So Peru restricts single-use plastics in vulnerable areas like beaches and national parks. In 2019, the European Parliament voted to ban single-use plastic items for which alternatives exist on the market by 2021. And Thailand's ban on single-use plastic bags at major stores went into effect earlier this year, and they're hoping to phase out all single-use plastic bags entirely by 2021. That's just a sampling of the variety of activity that is happening out there among other countries. And so with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So we're going to take it, like Stephanie said, a step lower and talk about regional level initiatives. So for those unfamiliar with the Great Lakes region, we have much of the same marine debris issues as the world's oceans, including plastics in our waterways and on our coastlines. So if you want to go to the next slide, Stephanie, please. Okay. The NOAA Marine Debris Program works to address the issue not only in the oceans, but in the Great Lakes as well. We do that through research, removal, prevention, emergency response, and regional coordination. We are a national program, but we have staff in each of the regions as well, and I am based in Ohio and work with stakeholders around the Great Lakes region to tackle marine debris. Next slide, please. So the legislative summary and the plastic bag research we're going to hear today are both part of larger efforts to address marine debris in the Great Lakes region. Marine debris stakeholders in the region have developed a 5-year action plan, which outlines comprehensive and strategic actions to ensure that the Great Lakes and its coast, people, and wildlife are free from the impacts of marine debris. The plastic bag research and summary are actually part of 2 actions that are in the action plan. Both actions are being led by Ohio Sea Grant. The first is to complete 5 social science studies on marine debris. That includes some investigations on behavior change. So Jill will be presenting next on some of that research. And then the second is focused on developing a summary paper, which this legislative memo that Sarah will be presenting here in a short while will help with that. It focuses on the effectiveness of current marine debris policies and behavior change mechanisms in an effort to inform new policy actions. So if anybody would like more information on the action plan, there is a link there at the bottom of the slide, but also happy to chat offline about it as well. And now I think I'm turning things over to Jill.
Thank you, Sarah and Stephanie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So my name is Jill Bartolotta. I'm an extension educator with Ohio Sea Grant, and today I'd like to talk about some of the work that has been funded by the NOAA Marine Debris Program, looking at consumer behavior change and support for policies that aim to reduce our access and use to single-use plastics. So next slide. So most of my work that I've been doing with my colleague Scott Hardy, who's also an educator with Ohio Sea Grant, is going to focus on reusable bags. We have done some work with restaurant businesses in regards to straws, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on our disposable plastic bag work. Next slide. So several years ago, Scott and I were asked by the City of Cleveland Mayor's Office of Sustainability to look into why people use plastic bags when we have reusable bags available to us. And what we found is that about 50% of people have these bags. They just forget to bring them into the store or put them in their car when they're leaving their house. About 34% of people are going to then use that bag for something else. And when we looked farther into that, it's going to line garbage cans or be used to pick up pet waste. So as educators and scientists, we thought, well, how do we get people to use the bags that they already have? Next slide. So what we did is, along with some interns from Case Western Reserve University, we developed signage to be put in grocery stores explaining the issue of bags when they get into the natural environment, putting up signs prompting people to ask them if they brought their own bags. And then we did extensive outreach at the stores where we talked to customers, answered their questions, and we also gave them 3 reminder items, you know, because we're trying to get people to use their bags. So we gave out keychains, magnets, and then window decals. The idea is these could be placed on keys, on the magnetic doors that go, the metal doors that go out to your garage, or in your car as prompts to either remind other people to grab their own bags, but also reminding you to grab your bags. And what we found is that keychains were actually, they were the most preferred item that people wanted, but they were also the most effective at getting people to grab their bags, because when you leave your house, you need your car keys. So if you have a little reminder on there to grab your bags, it's a pretty simple way to remind yourself. Next slide. So also, we wanted to get information from consumers about their support for plastic bag legislation. So at least in my area of Cleveland, Ohio, legislation around eliminating or charging fees for the use of disposable plastic bags is very contentious. And in conversations with decision makers, they constantly say there's no scientific research, or they say people don't want this, this isn't what they want. So we decided to ask people what they wanted. And if you look at the graph here, you can see legislation on the bottom. People are in support of disposable bag bans or bag fees to limit their access to plastic bags. But what's also important is that you have about a quarter of people who are not in support of this legislation. And what we've found when we look through the literature for other cities or states or countries that have implemented plastic bag policies without support from the public, they get a lot of pushback. And this legislation often gets reversed. And then you actually find people using more plastic bags than what they were using before the legislation. So what's really important with this type of legislation is that the people are involved and that this goes to public vote. If some, next slide, please. So we also wanted to see, do people support businesses? Because like I said, there's not a lot of policy in my area. So we're actually seeing businesses take this upon themselves to either phase out plastic bags, to charge for plastic bags, or restaurants are starting to phase out plastic straws, plastic carryout containers. So we wanted to see if these businesses have support from their consumers, because the last thing we want to happen is for these businesses to lose revenue because they're trying to take more sustainable actions. And what we found is that people are in support of businesses who are going to charge for plastic bags. Next slide. We then also asked people if they're in support for businesses that will no longer offer any plastic bags at all. And as again, you can see there is support for this type of sustainable behavior change. And we actually did some more in-depth work with focus groups at a local clothing store that the owner took it upon herself to remove plastic bags from her store. And we had conversations with the customers, we had conversations with the staff. The majority of people really didn't care that plastic bags were no longer used. There was a small percentage of people that were very excited about this. There was a small percentage of people that were very upset by this, but for the most part, people kept shopping there and kept supporting her business. She didn't lose business, and she did a process where she phased them out, and she brought us in to do education to help the customers get used to this idea. So what's really important as we see legislation that's trying to phase out plastics is we need there to be a phase-in period where a lot of education happens, because the last thing you want is the person working at the grocery store or the clothing store to take all of the anger from the people who can no longer get the plastic bags. So it needs to be, like I said, a phase-in process with a lot of education to the customers before the item is completely eliminated. Next slide. And then lastly, if we get rid of bags, do people have access to their own bags? A lot of times you go to any type of outreach event, there's always people giving out reusable bags if you sign up for their email list. And what we found is that people have their own bags. Reusable bags are very resource costly. They're more resource costly than disposable plastic bags. So really we need to stop producing so many things to give people, because people have their own bags to use. And so what we really need to do as educators or those people working in outreach is just reminding people to use the bags, crates, boxes, whatever it is that they already have, instead of continuing to give them free reusable bags, because that doesn't alleviate the issue of using resources to make these items or having to deal with these items if they get in the natural environment. Next slide. So like I said, Scott and I, we've been working on this research for about 5 years now. We still have some data to analyze, but we hope to get all of this research out and published within the next 6 months to a year. However, we do have some reports already available. The first two will talk about our plastic bag work, where we were trying to figure out why people don't use their reusable items. Then we've now summarized pretty much all of this data into a summary report. And then during COVID, we have seen a spike in the use of plastics, as well as a temporary pause in plastics legislation. So we did do some work around bag use during COVID, and that's that final report. And I'm always happy to talk about this if you have any questions, so please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Bowling. I'm a senior research counsel at the National Sea Grant Law Center. Today, I'm going to present some of the research that we've done. So to start with, in 2018, the Law Center provided a memo to Ohio Sea Grant regarding plastic bag bans enacted by local governments, and looked at how that legislation's impacted by state laws. Christina Alexander at the Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant Legal Program and I worked together on that research. And at the time, several states banned local plastic bans, and only one state had banned plastic use. But since then, things have changed rapidly at both the state and local levels. So in 2020, Ohio Sea Grant again asked us to update that memo And the Law Center looked at what states and local governments had been doing. And then we broadened it a little bit. We looked at state or local actions in the Great Lakes for other plastic or trash bans, including straws, cigarette butts, styrofoam, balloons. And then finally, we looked a little bit into the impact of COVID on some of these state and local plastic bans. So I'm going to share that research with you. This slide, I wanted to outline a little bit about the state divide. Some states have or allow local plastic bans, which ban businesses from supplying plastic bags or other plastic items. These may be enacted, excuse me, at a statewide level by the legislature or at the local level through the passage of an ordinance. And then on the other hand, there are the state laws that prohibit local governments from setting these local standards on plastic bag use. These state laws are called preemptive bans, or bans is what I refer to them as. So on the next slide, the first category that I'm going to talk about is state and municipal acts limiting or banning plastic bags. So when we did the 2018 memo, California was the first true statewide ban. Now there are 9 states with state bans, and many local governments have acted to regulate plastic bag use too. So we're going to talk about those. So the District of Columbia, I wanted to mention, was the first non-municipal entity to restrict plastic bag usage. In 2009, they enacted a 5-cent fee on plastic bags. I include Hawaii on this map also, because even though they don't have a statewide ban, each of the 4 counties in Hawaii have enacted a ban. So they have a de facto statewide ban. And then I wanted to touch on some of the other state actions in the past couple of years. Connecticut implemented a 10-cent plastic bag fee. The governor issued an executive order delaying the implementation of that through June 30th, 2020 due to COVID. But they also have an outright ban on the use of plastic bags, which will come into play July 1st, 2021. Then Delaware also has a plastic bag ban set to go into effect January 2021. Maine enacted a law in 2019 that prohibits businesses from providing single-use carryout bags. That was scheduled to go into effect April 2020, but was delayed due to COVID until January 15th, 2021. Oregon also has a plastic bag prohibition, which was temporarily lifted during COVID due to a paper bag shortage. New York passed a plastic bag ban that had not been enforced until recently. That was due to some pending litigation. A plastics company had sued the state, challenging the constitutionality of that ban. And a New York court upheld the ban, just striking down a portion of the regulations that were the minimum thickness of the reusable bags. And so this month, the state has said that it's going to begin to enforce the ban again. Excuse me. Vermont is another one with a comprehensive law that regulates plastic carryout bags. Washington's law will go into effect January 1st. And then New Jersey isn't up there yet, but its legislature has passed a bill that's awaiting the governor's signature. So we can move to the next. So these are local governments that have bans or restrictions on plastic bag use. The states in blue all have local governments with plastic bags or restrictions. Since 2018, Texas has been removed from that list. There were several Texas local governments with bans, but they repealed those following a court ruling finding that the state solid waste law preempted the ordinances. And then you'll notice that several of the states are underlined here. Some of the local governments in these states have bag bans on the books, but these states have bag ban preemption laws So I'll discuss that in just a little bit when I get to the preemption bans. So on the next slide, I wanted to note some of the Great Lakes provinces that have municipalities with plastic bag bans. In Ontario, Fort Francis and Mono have bag bans. Ottawa's considering a ban. There are some in Quebec. I won't try to pronounce those because my French is not good. And then I wanted to mention that I've seen in the news that Canada is considering a countrywide plastics ban in 2021 that would include plastic bags, straws, and other single-use plastic items. Okay, on the next slide, we have the states in orange have plastic bag preemption laws or bans. Since 2018, 6 states have added laws banning the regulation of plastic bags, bringing the total number to 15. And many of these states have enacted legislation that closely follows a model law that was prepared by the American Legislative Exchange Council. On the next slide, we have some key provisions of that model legislation. It defines auxiliary container to mean any receptacle of any fabrication designed to transport purchases from or at a food service or retail facility. It prohibits local governments from regulating these containers, including taxing them. It states that it doesn't apply to curbside recycling or recycling programs, and says that it doesn't apply on local government property. And so some of the states follow this model precisely, others have modified it slightly, but at least 6 states produce their own legislation to restrict local ordinances. So next, I wanted to look at what happens when local ordinances have enacted plastic bans and the state law prohibits them from doing so. So first, I wanted to mention Florida. So in 2008, the Florida legislature passed a temporary law prohibiting local regulation of plastic bags. It was described as temporary. While they were studying there's been no legislation. And then in the meantime, several local governments in Florida have enacted plastic bans, including Coral Gables. And shortly after that, the Florida Federation sued Coral Gables, alleging the ordinance violated the state statute. The lower court upheld the ordinance. However, an appellate court reversed that, saying that the statute was constitutional and preempted the city's ban. So the Florida Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal. So that means that Coral Gables' ban is effectively preempted. And other municipalities have repealed bans due to the threat of litigation in that state. Minnesota, the state legislature passed a preemption law in 2017 that specifically allowed merchants to provide plastic bags and banned cities from banning bags. Both Minneapolis and Duluth had bag ban ordinances that were set to go into effect that year, but they were preempted by the law. But those cities, they regrouped, they tried again, and they enacted ordinances that required retailers to charge customers 5 cents for each single-use plastic bag. And these types of fees were not specifically prohibited by state law. Colorado is another state with a broad ban on local governments regulating plastic. Several local governments there charge fees, so that's the way they get around it. But I saw at least one town that has an outright ban that hasn't been challenged in court yet. Texas's local government laws were preempted according to the Texas Supreme Court. And then finally, the Ohio legislature passed a bill that would prohibit local governments from banning plastic bags, and the governor has said that he will sign that. That's a temporary measure which sunsets in 1 year, so the Ohio local governments are at least temporarily not able to enforce any bans that they have. So on the next slide, I wanted to turn to some other plastic bans in the Great Lakes. You can see the categories there, and I'll just go through those one by one and give some examples. in the Great Lakes states. So to start with, there's only one Great Lakes state that's enacted statewide laws regarding the use of single-use plastics or polystyrene expanded foam, also known as styrofoam. So in 2020, New York enacted a state law that prohibits food service providers from selling, offering for sale, or distributing disposable food service containers that contain styrofoam. So that's the only state in the Great Lakes that does that. I think there are some outside the Great Lakes, Maine, Vermont, and Maryland that also regulate those things. So on the next slide, you'll see some local governments in Minnesota, New York, and Pennsylvania that have enacted ordinances regarding single-use plastics and styrofoam. Minneapolis has the Green to Go ordinance, which requires food and beverage sold for immediate consumption to be placed in what they call environmentally acceptable packaging. And that packaging must meet the reuse, recycling, or composting standards that are set out in the ordinance. The ordinance prohibits styrofoam unless they're used for an exempted purpose, such as nursing homes or hospitals, and utensils, straws, and stir sticks are not included in that ordinance. St. Louis Park, Minnesota has a no waste ordinance that prohibits food establishments from selling food or beverage packaging, which is not zero waste packaging. Single-use cups and containers and utensils must be compostable, and straws may be provided upon request. And then New York has several local governments, but I put one example up there at Suffolk County. They prohibit any disposable food service item that contains styrofoam. They also regulate straws. And then Narberth, Pennsylvania, they prohibit the distribution of single-use plastic straws, but they do allow reusable straws, recyclable straws, or compostable straws. And then in Canada's Great Lakes provinces, an example there is Fort Frances, Ontario. They prohibit styrofoam single-use food packaging, and that will go into effect in January 2021. And then, as I noted above, Canada is considering the countrywide plastics ban in 2021. Okay, on the next slide, we have balloon releases. These are more uncommon than some of the other plastic bans. I found one example in the Great Lakes, East Hampton, New York. They prohibit the intentional release or disposal of any balloon except in public receptacles, authorized private receptacles, or recycling centers. And it also prohibits a person or entity from organizing the release of, or condoning the release of, or intentionally causing the release of any balloon. So under that one, you get in trouble for even organizing a balloon release. Okay, on the next slide, we have bottles. These are a great way to encourage people to recycle their containers. And there are 2 Great Lakes states that have these. Michigan has a 10-cent deposit fee on beverage containers. New York has a 5-cent fee. And then Canada's not up there, but St. Hippolyte in Quebec enacted a ban on single-use water bottles less than 1 liter in June of 2020. Okay, in the next slide, smoking bans. A lot of coastal communities have banned smoking on their beaches to reduce the amount of cigarette butts that are left behind. I didn't find a statewide law banning smoking at beaches in any Great Lakes state, but there are municipalities in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Pennsylvania that have enacted laws prohibiting smoking in public parks and beaches. One example is Chicago. They ban smoking at beaches, playgrounds, and buildings owned or operated by the park district, and then violation of that ban is a $500 fine. The Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has smoke-free beaches. They've designated 44 of the state's 54 state swimming beaches as smoke-free. Okay, and then on the next slide, as I noted earlier, some of these laws have been temporarily affected due to COVID-19, citing the risk of the spread of COVID on reusable bags. Some states and municipalities and even retailers have lifted plastic bag bans or completely banned reusable bags. That stemmed from a couple of early studies from the NIH and CDC on the transmission of COVID-19 from surfaces. However, now that it's believed that the spread of the virus through touching surfaces is much lower, that's not so much the case, but in the beginning of the pandemic, it definitely drove some states and local actions related to the plastic bans. So on the next slide, this is just showing that many states, local governments, and retailers prohibited reusable bags. They were just under the assumption that they would be a primary way to transmit the virus. New Hampshire's governor temporarily directed all retailers to use single-use bags. He prevented them from using reusable bags, but that was lifted in June. The Massachusetts governor issued an order in March prohibiting reusable checkout bags. That order banned grocery stores and pharmacies from charging for paper or plastic bags. It allowed the stores to issue paper or plastic despite any municipal bans on the single-use plastic bags. And that order was rescinded in June. And then San Francisco is an example of a city that issued an order preventing businesses from allowing customers to bring their own bags or reusable items. And that prohibition was lifted in May of 2020. Okay, on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight that the pandemic also led to the temporary discontinuation of plastic bans. In April, the California governor suspended the statewide plastic ban for 60 days due to the coronavirus. And in Oregon, the governor temporarily relaxed its ban on plastic bags because several grocery stores prohibited reusable bags during the first days of the pandemic. And then COVID also led to the delay of some of the plastic bans by state and local governments. As Jill mentioned earlier, Maine's governor delayed the state's ban on single-use plastic bags from going into effect until January 15th, 2021. The Connecticut governor issued an executive order delaying the implementation of the plastic bag fee there through June 30th, 2020. So that's all. The next slide, please, Stephanie. So as you've seen, and as Jill mentioned, the plastic bans can be very divisive. There are strong advocates on both sides, and the states are split as to what they will and will not allow. But I put the link to our report up here if anyone is interested in reading the full thing. That's my email also if you'd like more information. And I just wanted to encourage everyone to follow us on Facebook and Twitter because we post all of our publications and reports there. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Jill and Sarah. I think now we'll open it up to questions. We have had some come into the chat box, which we can go through, but keep using the chat. I think we've had a couple that relate to using or like handing out, like, some of the outreach materials also involve distributing, materials like keychains and other things with that, which I think might have been addressed in another comment, but any of the speakers were welcome to take that. Jill, I don't know it. I know you talked about your keychain. It looked like that keychain might have been wooden, but I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that great question. And this is something we definitely considered. But in looking back, the window decal probably an unnecessary item. And when we do go to publish these results, we will recommend that that is not a useful tool for reminding people to bring their own bags. But we were very careful in the items we tried to choose. Yes, we moved to more expensive options like a wooden and metal keychain instead of a plastic keychain because we were trying to limit our use of plastics. And really the idea is, can we give someone something made out of wood, metal, organic cotton, make something that's more of a sustainable material that could remove hundreds to thousands of disposable plastic bags from the waste stream over that person's use? Because really when we look at behavior studies, you see things that says 30 days, 60 days to change a behavior. It's a couple months that it takes time to change someone's behavior. And the idea is if we can change someone's behavior that they no longer need these reminder items and it's just part of their everyday actions, and then they teach their family, their friends, other people about these actions that they're taking. Our eventual goal is that we don't need any of these reminder items. We don't need signs. We don't need little items to remind people. It just becomes a part of our society. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, so we do need something to prompt people to remind them. There have been conversations of possibly developing a phone app to trigger people when they get to shopping centers or grocery stores that would trigger them to grab their bags, but that is farther down the road in development. So we'll see about that. So thank you for bringing that question up. It is something that we are looking at outreach to give less to people at outreach events, because unfortunately, as many educators know, no one will come to your booth unless you're giving away cool stuff. So we're looking at more sustainable items, and we're actually trying to move into giving people these more reusable items so they can phase out the single-use plastics. And then I believe I saw another question, Stephanie, about my project. So if I could answer that one.
Yes,
it's
yeah, go
about
ahead.
the quality of reusable bags. So it was on the graph. We did ask if reusable bags were not a suitable carrying container for what the person was buying. And there were a very small percentage of people who did choose that. Typically, though, people were referring to meats. People are not comfortable putting meats in reusable containers. They prefer meats to be put in single-use plastic bags. And when you see a lot of the plastic legislation come out, there's usually loopholes in that legislation, and plastic bags for meats is one single-use plastic bag that is usually still allowed because people are uncomfortable with the contamination possibilities for their reusable bags. But no, it's mostly people just forget their bags.
Great, thanks, Jill. So another commenter noted that the governor of Ohio did sign the ban for the state on October 13th, but then had a question about, do the communities or states that are requiring compostables have the facilities for dealing with that waste stream, like separate collection containers or composting facilities?
So I'll answer really quick for Ohio. So the reason this legislation was signed is because of COVID concerns. So it's been put into effect for 1 year. The only local ordinance it was going to affect would be Cuyahoga County. Their bag ban was supposed to go into effect July 1st of this year. It was postponed to January of 2021 because of COVID, but then the governor's signing of the order has now halted that for another year. At least in our area of Cuyahoga County, actually the city of Cleveland no longer offers recycling of any items because their contract was up. So they're looking for a new contractor and how to better recycle in the city of Cleveland, which is a part of Cuyahoga County. And then there's only one local group doing composting in Cuyahoga County. They're called Rust Belt Riders, and they are a very small operation, and they typically go to people's houses to collect their food organics. And we have to be careful when we talk about compostable plastics because there's usually a high contamination of virgin plastic, and composters are very wary to accept compostable plastics for fear of ruining the organic composting that they're creating. So at least in our area, we do not have good recycling or composting options for people or businesses right now.
Great, thanks. And I guess this is can maybe be a follow-up question to you. Another question was, for better or worse, science and technology brought us the plastic bag and other single-use plastics a decade ago. Can any of the panelists provide some insight into where we are in contemporary science and technology working to create sustainable alternatives that can realistically replace our use of current options?
Sure, I can touch base on that too. And maybe Sarah, you might have some more knowledge on this. But I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing about biodegradable, compostable plastics being created out of corn, other plant-based materials. In theory, these materials are wonderful. However, they need to be sent to industrial composting facilities, which, as I've just mentioned, are lacking, especially in the Great Lakes region, because your backyard composting, first of all, we don't shred the items that go in backyard composting, which is required to break down these materials, but also our backyard composters typically don't get hot enough to truly break down these biodegradable plastics. Second, I'll say again, there is usually a high contamination with virgin plastic. And then lastly, when these biodegradable plastics get in the natural environment, they do break down quicker than single-use plastics. So that's good and bad because it makes it harder for us to clean them up because they tend to become the microplastics at a much faster rate than virgin plastic. There has been some research and I've asked researchers about this, the worms that are able to ingest and eat plastic. There is some progress moving forward with that. However, that research is still so new that we're not quite sure if the byproducts they are creating are necessarily good or bad. So as far as technology advances, we need to work towards moving to using reusable items, which many nations like Canada are looking at circular economies, or trying to figure out how to make plastics as recyclable as possible. However, plastic eventually does have an end of life limit, and it can only be what we call downcycled so many times. So one interesting thing, microfibers, those are plastics that shed from our synthetic clothing. Textile companies are redesigning the way they create these clothing so that they will shed less through wear and through washing. So that's a technology advance that we're seeing. Also, we're seeing technology advances in filters that will be put on washing machines to help trap some of those microfibers that come from our clothing when we wash it. Because really, when we look at the issue of microplastics, microfibers are of the greatest concern for wildlife ingestion and human ingestion. So I hope that answers your question. There's a lot going on, so it's all very hopeful. There's just not a, it's such new research that's being done that we don't have a lot of end answers quite yet.
Great, thanks, Jill. So then there were also a couple of questions related to some of the international, participant mentioned that the American Chemistry Council is fighting plastic bans on all levels, and that is contributing to the US not signing the statement on plastics from the G5, G7, you know, those different international measures. Yeah, I would also mention that the plastic bag manufacturers and manufacturers of plastic single-use items are also advocating against any of the legislative bans. So there is advocacy from the manufacturers against these policies. Another person asked whether any states are pushing for joining the international efforts that I mentioned. I'm not aware of any specific examples off the top of my head, although California is often at the forefront of arguing that, you know, we should be involved in some of these international efforts. Now, there are a lot of non-governmental organizations like Ocean Conservancy and Greenpeace and Nature Conservancy that do have initiatives that involve cities and communities. I think there's one called Trash Free Seas, and that's probably where states and cities are most active in those type of educational programs. Tara, this might be, I don't know if you specifically looked at this, someone asked about thinking about other governments. Were you able to find any ordinance or actions led by tribal nations?
Yeah, that was kind of outside the scope of what we were looking at, but I definitely have seen that there are some tribal nations that have passed bans or are considering bans. I think the Navajo Nation was one that I saw, but we didn't really include that in our report.
Is anyone pushing for higher recycled content in plastic bags. I'm not aware of that showing up in any of the legislation that we looked at, but that could be part of some advocacy campaigns. Jill, I don't know if.
Yeah, so at least for the original legislation for Cuyahoga County, for, like I said, those loopholes where plastic bags would still be allowed, the plastic bags had to be made of 100% recycled content. So if you're trying to think how we recycle plastics into bags, most plastic bottles become a plastic bag. That's that process of downcycling.
Thanks. Couple more questions. Do any of these programs include a serious effort to make manufacturers responsible for the ultimate disposition of their products, petroleum-based plastics in any form, including cigarette butts? Yeah, I think that's been a long ongoing policy debate about where the burden should rest with respect to manufacturing products and their life cycle. But with respect to the legislation that we were summarizing here, it's not intentionally to shift the burden to the manufacturers. So Jill, do you know, there's a question about when people return single-use plastic bags to the store, what is the fate of those bags? Do they actually get recycled or are they just landfilled?
So we actually are working right now with the hauling companies to find out this answer. So stay tuned. I don't have the answer right now.
Okay. Thanks. And it looks like we might just have one more. I think, Jill, you might have touched on it. Someone mentioned the clothing companies promoting the use of the fabrics made from recycled plastic, where you were talking about changing it to reduce the shedding, but is that greenwashing, as those products would also be likely to shed microfibers?
I don't know if you'd call it greenwashing. I think they're just being honest of what the material is made out of, because the truth is plastic bottles either become plastic bags or they become synthetic fibers to make like our fleece jackets. So I can't speak to say if the companies are greenwashing or not, but yes, if an item is made out of synthetic materials, so polyethylene, polypropylene, nylon, rayon, those are all synthetic plastics. Those items shed through wear and tear, and they shed in the washing process. So yes, you are shedding microfibers if you wear that clothing.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Well, our speakers can skim through the comments to see if I've missed anything that you want to address while we're wrapping up. But I do want to mention that we will be making both the presentation slides available following the webinar today and the recording. You'll also have all of the speakers' contact information, and I'm sure everyone would be happy if you can follow up directly if you want any more information about their work or programs or what they covered in today's presentations. So with that, just Sarah, Jill, Tara, if you had any last remarks.
There's just a couple more questions that came through.
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah, as far as offering people food at events, we are not allowed to do that because of allergy concerns. So like I've said, we are taking this very seriously as outreach and educators to try to limit the amount of items we give to people and really focus more on having interactive activities at our booths to attract people instead of giving people things. And then, yes, like I said, this is part of ongoing research. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of people doing this research. It seems like sometimes Scott and I are in a little bubble doing this by ourselves, but our goal is to continue doing this research. COVID did halt a lot of our research because we were unable to travel. And if people can't use bags, then how can we study if they're using bags? So our plan is to keep doing this research over the next several years and continue working with national and international researchers who are trying to implement similar studies in their own areas. So, so I just want, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I was happy to be able to talk with all of you.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks everyone. We really appreciate it. And glad that you could join us, and stay tuned for more information. Thanks.